the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India at home.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the 81 All Out podcast. This is Siddhartha Vaidyanathan at Sidvi on Twitter. And I'm joined today by a special guest from London, the playwright, screenwriter, and dramaturge, Maatin, who has written this wonderful play called Duck that is going to be running in theaters soon for those in Britain. And for those outside Britain, I must tell you that this is a wonderful play. So if you can, get a chance to watch it or get a chance to read it, it's really, really well done. So welcome, Maatin. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Fantastic. So as an introduction, Maatin is, as I said, a playwright, and he was longlisted for BBC Comedy Room in 2020 and nominated for the Edinburgh TV Festival New Voice Awards in 2021. And he was also selected for the Hampstead Theatre's Inspire program in 2020-2021 and has worked with the Royal Court. So a lot of accomplishments there. Also, as I said, for my listeners in Britain particularly, this play is going to be running at the Arcola Theatre between 27th June and 15th July. So I would highly recommend that you find tickets for it and watch the play. Anyway, talking about the play, Duck, in Maatin's own words, brings out the experience of a South Asian child amid a sea of whiteness. Now, you may be wondering what this play is doing in a podcast that primarily focuses on cricket. But the reason it's here is because this 15-year-old protagonist called Ismail is a star cricketer in his London public school. And the play basically follows him through the summer of 2005. And as we all know, plenty of things happened in 2005, one of which cricket fans will remember for the iconic Ashes series that happened when England won the Ashes for the first time since 1989. But also, as people may remember, this was also the year of the 7/7 London bombings, the tragic events that caused so much of upheaval in Britain and the world too. So, Maatin, you can start off by giving us a bit of an introduction about this play, what it's about, what drove you to writing it, and how much of it is shaped by your own experiences of attending a public school in Britain. I think they call it private school there, even though it is publicly funded.
Yeah, it's that's a particular nuance that exists really only in English schools, and there's lots to learn from that exists in the world of this play. I think in particular, we choose to have language that, only certain people understand and only certain people get to understand. And, that's the sort of system that we're talking about in this play, something that I experienced growing up. I'm born and raised in London in the UK. And I had the particular experience of going to a very traditional, old school, public school, as we would call it here. And these are the sorts of schools you hear about on the news because they produce prime ministers and, people who are considered to be very grand and very important. And there's lots of connotations that come along with that. So, definitely it's a strong theme in the play was to bring people into this world because, it's a very small, minuscule portion of society that actually goes to these schools. They've got high fees, big barriers to entry in terms of accessing them. And yet they hold a lot of significance in our society at large. So for me as a writer, that felt like a world to dive into, to expose a little bit to people who may not have an understanding or an intimate relationship to these places, and put it in relation to things like you described, for me and for many other people who will have attended places like this, it will often be one of, if not the only person of color in an establishment of this type, particularly 15 plus years ago, as we're talking about in my lifetime and also in the world of the play set in 2005. And yeah, I think as a writer, I'm a fairly new writer. This is the first full-length play that I'm bringing to the stage. And I think it's important to think about that as an opportunity. When I was given the opportunity to write a new play and think about, well, hopefully this will end up on a stage somewhere, I take that quite seriously, and I think of it also as a huge opportunity. I think theatre as an art form versus a novel or versus a television program, we have this very specific experience that people come into a place, they sit quietly for the most part, and they're willing to, and they accept the premise that they're going to receive what's happening in front of them, and there's no sort of responsiveness to that, right? So I see that as a great opportunity to not necessarily to tell people something or to be didactic in that respect, but to have a conversation perhaps and to engage in a dialogue, which again, I think increasingly in the world as a whole, having the time and the room and the to go into detail in terms of establishing a narrative or persuading people to a certain point of view is something that is diminishing more and more over time. So I was really excited, the idea that I might be able to spend 70, 80 minutes presenting something to people in a way that either they had never considered it before, or relating an experience that might actually be very familiar to a lot of people. And that is my primary motivation as a writer. I've grown up in London, seen a lot of theatre. Very rarely have I seen my own experiences, my own cultural identity demonstrated on stage in an authentic way or at all. And I was motivated to become a writer in order to do that, to diversify our storytelling a little bit, particularly as it relates to South Asian characters and to Muslim characters, which is my heritage, my background, my identity, and really be part of that change, create opportunities for performers from these backgrounds as well, in front of on the stage and behind the scenes. There are incredible creatives in this community who come from South Asian backgrounds and Muslim backgrounds that are rarely given the opportunity to put those on display. And this was a real opportunity for me, like I said, to tell a story from a different perspective that people might not have seen before, which is a South Asian boy in this very traditional school. But yet, rather than him being the fish out of water and being sort of, highlighted for his difference, he's the star cricketer, and that makes him popular. That gives him a lot of status, and that felt really fun as a place to dive in.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, this is the first time actually that I actually realized that 2005 could actually have had so many consequences to people other than the fact that England won the Ashes. I mean, in popular discourse, everything that people talk about is 2005, England won the Ashes, cricket came to the front pages. People were so, fanatical about that particular moment. And also about how that was the last series that was shown on free-to-air television in Britain, which is a huge deal for the popularity of the sport. But reading this play, it occurs to me how the 7/7 bombings at that time had such a profound effect on Muslims in Britain that their view of the 2005 Ashes could be very, very different because of how much of an effect the scrutiny around the 7/7 bombings had. Where were you in 2005? How old were you? And talk a bit about that.
Yeah, the parallels that exist in the play are closest to that in my world, which is that I was 15 at that age, very formative age, cusp of adolescence, trying to figure out who you are, where you fit into the world, grappling with identity in every respect. And I think that's what made it such an exciting thing to write about too, because it felt really true, and it does stick in my mind. And when we talk about the Muslim experience in the Western world of this generation, a lot of people, depending on where you're based, and whether that's, let's say, in the UK versus the US, for instance, we'll talk about the change and impact of 9/11 as such a significant event in terms of how Muslims have been treated subsequently, in the conversation that relates to Islam subsequently in the West, and all of the consequences of that. But I thought for me, particularly, and for its Londonness as well, this 7/7, I was a little bit older, I was a little bit more aware of what was going on, very acutely aware, in fact. And so that to me felt even more significant than, let's say, a comparable event like 9/11. I think growing up and being part of this very particularly English environment that I was in, primarily because of my schooling, something like my religious identity or cultural identity was very not really talked about in many of the environments I was in, because it wasn't shared by many people. So it was something that happened at home, and it was a big part of my home life, but in a not really something that was on display, let's say, necessarily elsewhere. And suddenly that power was taken away from me, in the sense that everybody had an opinion on what a Muslim was, what one stood for, the ins and outs of the Quran and the religion. And so it was quite discombobulating in that respect, that suddenly everyone seemed to know something about Islam or had an opinion on Islam. And again, in many rooms, a lot of gazes turned to me as either to condemn the actions of terrorists or to speak on behalf of violent perpetrators of murder and of terrorism, which for a 15-year-old is a crazy sort of position to be thrown into, and one that stays with you, obviously. And then for me, I think, writing about it now, I'm 33 years old now, I still live in London, and I've seen the sort of, what I would say, the impact of 7/7 on British Muslims living in the UK today, and policy making that has come as a consequence of that, the securitization, surveillance, hostile nature and attitudes towards Muslims that exist in Britain that are very sort of well embedded in our politics and our society at large. There's huge amounts of ignorance, huge amounts of violence, and just like a general attitude towards Muslims, which is anti-Britain, anti-Western. And I think a lot of that has come out of 7/7, right? For people who are decision makers in the government, and by and large, they're able to pin the choices they've made and how they can treat Muslims in our society on a violent and tragic event like 7/7. And to me, that is really part of the conversation of the play, and something I want people to remember and think about is like, how are we treating Muslims in our society today, and what are the reasons for that, and can we question those?
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes of the play is also one of, identity plays a major part, but also one of the immigrant. And I love the relationship that the protagonist Ismail shares with his father in the play. And his father is an immigrant from India, and he has come, many years ago. Ismail, of course, was born in Britain, and is the British Muslim, is the hyphenated British Muslim. But his father seems to have a lot of allegiance to India. He's a big fan of Sachin Tendulkar, and also, he wants Ismail to, follow in the footsteps of Sachin Tendulkar. So there is that as well. So it's interesting how the talk of a British Muslim, whether it's in the cricket context or elsewhere, is becomes so much of a monolith, as if all the British Muslims have the same history and culture and practices and identity, when there is so much of diversity in that itself. I mean, a Muslim immigrant from India would see Britain vastly differently from a Muslim immigrant from Pakistan or from any other part of the world. So is that something that you wanted to bring out as well? That and also about how in the public perception in Britain, it seems that a Muslim immigrant is always associated with Pakistan, when in fact there are a large number of Indian Muslims who went to Britain as well.
Totally. I think those are the nuances that I hope that a particular audience will recognize in coming to see this show, for instance, or to hear about the themes of the play or the characters in the play. And quite deliberately, I've tried to bring as many, let's just use that same hyphenate, like British Muslim voices into the creative process. So we have a creative team of 10, 11 people. And within that spectrum, we've got people of Pakistani heritage, people of Malaysian heritage, people of Indian heritage like myself. And like you said, we are absolutely not a monolith. And I was very conscious of that in developing the play, that I didn't want to speak on behalf of all Muslims, let alone all British Muslims, let alone all British Indian Muslims. And how could I create an environment that allowed us to challenge those perceptions and create different, or I guess expose the differences that do exist in our cultures, communities as well. And that was a real challenge, because first and foremost, the British theatre industry isn't chock full of a Rolodex of brown people, let alone Muslim identifying ones, to find. So I've lent heavily on the relationships I've built up in the last few years in coming into this industry to sort of, put together a squad, much like a selector, to sort of try and create as many different skills and attributes in this room. And yet also recognizing that with one play, which is a one-person show and mainly seen through the eyes of one boy, we cannot relate the multitude of British Muslim experiences as well. And this is a jumping off point for me. You know, my hope is in my career to make many stories that will hopefully tell different versions, or relay the different experiences of different South Asian characters, different Muslim characters. This is one. And yeah, so that's obviously limiting in many ways. But yeah, it still feels really fresh. You know, that when I sat down to write the play, I'd never seen this character on stage before, and that's the sort of feedback I've received, which has been really gratifying. Whether that's from an actor's perspective, knowing that they've picked up this part and been like, "Wow, this is an opportunity for me to play a role with a lot of agency, with a lot of power in many respects in this character." That's something that they perhaps hadn't had the opportunity to do before. And also, you know, we did a short run of this play a year ago, and being in the audience among other people and having them come up to me afterwards as well and say, that reminded me of this thing that happened to me. And it might not have been exactly the same, and it might not have been on the basis of their Muslimness or their religion. It might have been skin color, it might have been class, it might have been just, you know, someone just looked at them the wrong way and decided to treat them poorly, which is sort of what happens to our main character, Ismail. He has a coach who really just takes a dislike to him. And I think for those of us who are minorities in a society, there's a lot of relatable experience that can be found in this story. And that's a very unfortunate truth, but it's a very motivating reason to tell this story, I guess.
Yeah, and the thing with cricket and identity is like when things are going well for Ismail, right? Like he's like he's a bit of a star in his school because he's batting so well, and there's a bit of popularity there. And as a minority, he feels vindicated. He's like, oh, okay, so this is my thing. Cricket is my thing. But the moment things start to go wrong, it's so apparent how the ruptures open up in a cricket team and how race and identity and religion and class and everything comes to the fore. And it's particularly important from a minority point of view because in the mainstream, of course, they have success and failure, but the level of exposure you have to these ruptures aren't as profound as it is when you are marginalized, isn't it?
100%. I think I drew a lot of inspiration from, I think, what's become a well-trodden and popular narrative, which is this idea of the good immigrant, exactly as you described, that as long as you're towing the line or meeting the standards that have been set for you, you're accepted. And we see that example primarily. I think the things that come to my mind are like elite athletes in Britain, for instance, someone like Mo Farah, you know, the long distance runner, is always held up as an example of, you know, someone, perhaps he wasn't considered good enough until he had multiple Olympic gold medals around his neck. And if you set that as the bar, you know, to be accepted as an immigrant in British society, then what hope do we have by and large? And then exactly like you said, and I think this to me is the context for why I've set this play in the school as well, is like, I think for Ismail's parents, they think, oh, we put him in this school, which is very British, very traditional, he'll be accepted as a consequence of that. Or we as a family, and we're meeting the standards of Britishness, British society, I guess this concept of assimilation. But as it happens in the play, and as we know from life, we'll always, perhaps even if we're striving for that ultimate assimilation angle, try and fit in. The people who are in the majority can always change their expectations of what it is that it means to fit in. And that's the biggest challenge for us as immigrants. And I also think the biggest fallacy about something like assimilation. Can we ever truly assimilate? If we're good enough, then maybe fine. But yeah, that lives on a very fine balance and on a knife edge, that as soon as, like you described, something goes wrong and we don't really know what wrong is yet, perhaps tomorrow or next week or next year, we'll suddenly be on the out again. And I think this for Ismail is a very important journey to sort of be the first time in his life that he's understanding that at age 15, if everything's gone really well for him so far just because he's been good at cricket, take that away and where is he left? Suddenly he's the brown kid among all the white kids. Suddenly, you know, that fractures his relationships perhaps, and that's really terrifying.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of benefit of doubt is hard to pin down but it is so easy to experience. Like if you are from a marginalized community, it is very likely that you're given very little benefit of doubt. And the very first mistake you make is amplified to such an extent that you are forced to apologize. Your whole nature takes a bit of a beating because of what has happened. But on the other hand, if you are part of the mainstream, if you are majority, if you look like a lot of people, if you behave like a lot of people, if you come from a certain background that is so-called accepted within quotes, then you're allowed those few more mistakes, and you're allowed excused a bit more. Now, this is extremely hard to quantify and to prove. So it's very easy to look and say, look, he didn't do well in 3 matches and he was dropped. But the fact is, how much of support did he have through those 3 games? How much of encouragement did he get through those failures? And that's now it's extremely hard to say, but it's very apparent to feel.
Yeah, I think that this is where really the cricket and the cricket team concept, I think, really took my interest as well, from the school team we build in the play, but also like the real life examples of this as well. And also the sort of mental impact in a game like cricket too. If you feel that pressure, we know as cricket fans and as players, perhaps, what that can do to a batsman, for instance. And if you feel like, everyone's against me, or the pressure is on me to perform, because if this coach doesn't believe I'm good enough to be in the team, that's probably going to actually produce a worse performance, unfortunately, than the alternative. And the play's called Duck because Ismail gets a couple of ducks, and again, the sort of cumulative effect of poor batting can just spiral, I think. And I think that's a really valuable thing to understand in a sporting context, is like, well, what are the parameters of success here? Like, the way in which the player is set up is that he's 15, he's the youngest player in the school's history to play for the top team. Like, that should be enough of proof that he's a good enough player. But like you described, a couple of bad performances and he's expendable. And I think that's, again, quite a strange concept to think about in a school world, right? Like, you're just a kid, and to have that amount of pressure heaped on you, and maybe not the right support structures, especially if you stick out for these other reasons, your teammates don't know how to pronounce your name and the coach looks at you funny and makes dodgy remarks to you. Like, it's all going to build up in a way that's not going to contribute positively. And I think we've seen this in the real world too. Like, breaking somebody's spirit in that way is sort of, that's broken for good. And players, whether that's been for this sort of England setup, which is closer to my understanding and in the research for this play, and just in terms of what I know about as well, if you think about when you've got, a journalist class that's saying, well, is Jofra Archer motivated to play well for England? Are they like, what kind of, we see these sort of coded language used all the time about non-white players or players that aren't from traditional English backgrounds. It was, and it's funny because it's not always about skin color either. I remember when Kevin Peterson, had stepped out of line, and again, they sort of questioned his loyalty because he was of South African origin. And I always, you grow up and you think about these things in great detail, which obviously the white majority people and players never have to think about. I used to worry about England players like decide to grow a beard and play on that field, and knowing what the English fans might say about them, especially you drop a catch or you do something wrong. You'll be written off just because you're different. And that is, it's just such a specific sporting thing that is really, really hard to grapple and just feels so difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about Kevin Peterson, but even somebody as mainstream as you would think Andy Murray, right? I mean, there was this famous sort of meme that used to do the rounds that when Andy Murray used to win, he was British, but when he used to lose, he was Scottish. And that the headlines in the newspapers would be like, Scott loses in 3rd round. Yeah. And people are like, this is ridiculous. Like, I mean, come on, you need to make some allowance for the bias that's creeping in here. I mean, make no allowance, I mean, for the bias that's creeping in here. In terms of, that point that you said about watching a player with a beard like a Moeen Ali or an Adil Rashid or something playing is not something that is has a long history. I mean, this is pretty recent stuff, and this is quite profound, actually. I mean, of course, Nasser Hussain captained the English team, but there's a difference between a Nasser Hussain and a Moeen Ali, who is like an obviously practicing Muslim who used to wear who has refused alcoholic sponsorship because of his religion, who is openly wearing a beard, who has spoken about his religious beliefs, and same with Adil Rashid, and I'm assuming same with Rehan Ahmed. I'm not too sure about his religious proclivities yet, but I'm saying that 2005, 2006 was perhaps the time when that was still not in the public imagination, to have a player representing England who is so obviously Muslim.
No, I mean, again, if you think about what are the lasting memories of the 2005 Ashes, it's actually the sort of alcoholic celebrations in Trafalgar Square and them falling around outside Downing Street, right? So you don't, and I'm pretty sure 90% of the squad, if not all of the squad, was white too. It was a particularly white team at that time, which again, now when it's only when you give it some thought that you pick up on those moments and things of that nature. And there's a couple of things I've given thought to about, attitudes today versus then. And one of them is obviously like the bravery of the person who dares to, actually put their values first potentially at the risk of losing their place in the team. And when you mentioned the alcoholic sponsorships, that reminded me of the South African player Hashim Amla, who I recall more than anybody was the name that they sort of spoke about. They used to be sponsored by Castle Lager, and he had the beard, and he was very clear about his values. And I remember them saying, "Oh, he might be fined. Is he a team player for being different?" And that's brave, right? When you're choosing, I know, a brilliant batsman too. No, we're not even talking about his cricketing ability. And perhaps it was his status as such a good player that gave him the confidence to say, I can stand on this ability, knowing that maybe they won't drop me because I'm so important to this team. I can actually speak to what I care about now and ask for something. And he's paved the way for the person that comes next, etc., etc. And then I also think about like the way in which cricket has changed since 2005 to now, and this sort of the prominence and the impact of something like the IPL, where you've got English players, Australian players flooding to India and spending significant amounts of time in a very different culture, and obviously probably being adored by a new fan base in that way as well. And hopefully attitudes have moved and shifted as a consequence of that, just exposure to something different to what they know and what they have previously understood to be right versus wrong, or just sort of, open their eyes a little bit. And maybe attitudes in the dressing rooms have matured a little bit to be more cater for more difference than previously.
Yeah, but what about attitudes of the public? I mean, now it's pretty normal. Of course, Moeen Ali has been playing for a really long time. Adil Rashid has been playing for a while. Both of them won the World Cup in 2019, which was a huge boost to them. And of course, that famous moment in that World Cup where the champagne goes off and then both of them just run away from that screen. I mean, which is quite ridiculous, honestly. I mean, if you have, there was, of course, a debate about whether people should be even celebrating with champagne when you have people in your team who are not fond of it. But of course, that's a different debate. But the point is that it's so normalized now. But do you think it is? Because, again, as I said, cricket's not on free-to-air television in Britain that often. People who are actually watching it are those who are really keen and paying for Sky and paying for other things. When you listen to commentary on, say, TMS, you're not really so aware of these things because you're just hearing the names. You're not actually seeing the beard, or you're not actually seeing the player. So do you think that things are still difficult for people to accept in many parts of Britain?
Yes, I think, and that's not a cricket specific thing.
Oh, yes.
Right. This is cricket shows us something that is happening in our society as a whole, obviously, and we can be informed in that way. So I think that like racism absolutely exists in our society, and our overall understanding of racism as a society is very, very poor. It's limited to the way in which is explained to the majority is that like racism is violent in very specific ways. It's the use of specific terms, language, physical violence, and that's it. And I think that is such a poor way to understand racism as a whole. And again, the play tries to sort of lend a very different perspective to what one may come away from it and be like, oh yeah, that was racist. This 15-year-old brown boy was treated racistly by his coach or by his teammates and this and that. But it's not necessarily shown to you in the play in what one might traditionally understand as like a racist act, for instance. And I guess, I think the thing that is coming into my mind straight away also from a cricket context that can be drawn out from is the sort of the whole narrative around Azim Rafiq, because in terms of how people have responded to that, understood that, accepted a man's testimony or a man's account of his own experiences dealing with systemic racism in a team setup, from his coaches, from his teammates. Generally speaking, I would say that the majority opinion is skeptical. They're like, well, what about, I'm not sure. Let's hear the other side. Oh, well, Michael Vaughan was great. He was England captain. How could he possibly be racist? Right? So the burden of proof is very, very high and always on the oppressed, not on the oppressor, to prove that racism exists. And if we set up our dynamic in that way, we'll never truly, convince, I think, people who are not willing to accept that racism exists, that it does. There will always be this pushback and this, prove it, or overall skepticism and disbelief in regard of that. So, I feel also like you will often hear, like, I think minoritized people in a situation be like, I can't wear that responsibility on my own shoulders, right? If I'm not sure in the England cricket team whether Moeen Ali or Adil Rashid have ever come out and said, like, sorry, please don't expect me to, be the one to solve this. And I would feel they are firmly entitled to do that, as any individual is. I think when we think about issues like this, we have to look at the system and the structures. And we can't, unfortunately, expect that, like, even if they were the best player in the world, that's going to, magically wave away the racism in our society. And that being said, it's just nice, I would say, to see more of these faces out there in other ways, right? Like, I want to write a play about a young brown cricketer so that other people feel seen. I think, having our own identities exist in our society as a whole is a great thing. Muslims are 3 million people in Britain. We should be seen and part of the fabric of society everywhere. So that we are represented in the England cricket team is overall a net positive, I would say, for our own experience.
Yeah, and the thing with Moeen Ali, of course, is that people can say all they want about hey, we have Moeen Ali and Adil Rashid playing for our team. They won the World Cup. They're such important members of our team. We have more Muslim players coming, etc., etc. But the moment Moeen Ali wore that wristband that said "Save Palestine," right? That's the moment when you saw what people actually perhaps think of him. Like, how dare a British Muslim player speak his mind? How dare he stand up for a cause? How dare he stand up for stand up for something political? Of course, the ICC sanctioned him because the ICC have rules about political statements and things. Of course, they don't really, they have their own inconsistencies with applying that, but fair enough. That's an organizational point of view. But as a public, as a fan, as a player, as a person who is following cricket in this country, the level of hate that he gets for speaking his mind, it's like the famous saying in the US when you say "shut up and dribble." You just play. You're not supposed to have a mind of your own.
Totally, and like that to me is the sort of the weight of the cultural hegemony, to use a sort of more academic term to describe it. And if you climb the rungs of establishment, which England cricket team is unfortunately a part of the establishment as a whole, that comes with a very sort of unfair set of rules and expectations of conformity. And this again comes back to our sort of myth of assimilation, which I think is a really important conversation to be having, a really important intergenerational difference that's in the play exists between father and son, and is a dialogue that I, as the child of people who moved to this country, have with my own parents. I don't question any of their choices, in the sense that, like, I think to sort of give the sort of very simple version of events, it'd be like, lots of people move to this country in pursuit of a better life for themselves or for greater opportunities, whether those were economic or otherwise. And I have massively benefited from that choice that my parents made. But does that validate this idea that, like, if we from another place come to this place, we will truly become part of this place? I don't necessarily today feel that that is true. And there are sort of proofs out there that confirm that to me all the time. And whether that could be like, I'm born with a British passport, and a lot of immigrants have been really sort of fastidious about that. Get the paperwork, get that in place. And yet we've seen in the UK, in the last 10 years, this incredibly important conversation about the Windrush generation, obviously, because of how the British Home Office changed their attitudes towards people that came to this country, lived here, worked here, paid their taxes, and then one day they woke up and they were told, you are not British. So I don't know today, as a lifelong holder of a British passport, whether I am truly British. Isn't that a fascinating thing?
And well, I think it's a contradiction that many people live with. The conservative argument, of course, is that you were born in Britain and you got all the benefits that Britain gave you. So how dare you not call yourself British? I mean, and Norman Tebbett's test, the Tebbett test, which actually is mentioned in the play, and it's remarkable. I don't think any other play has ever mentioned the Tebbett test before. But it's profound, because what was Norman Tebbett saying? He laid out this test that said that Indians, Pakistanis, people of Caribbean heritage who live in Britain, it is a test of who they support in cricket that tells you where their heart lies. But why? And this is the same thing that happens in India too now, by the way, because Muslims in India have this live with this burden of needing to show that they are patriotic enough to support India. It's almost like prove your patriotism to the country by supporting their team. Otherwise, you can get out of here. And it's quite insidious if you think about it, because, what is sport after all? Sport is like an appreciation of a craft and a skill. And if you go to a match that England are playing against, say, West Indies, and, as a person of Caribbean heritage or any heritage, if you look at a Brian Lara or a Curtly Ambrose or a Courtney Walsh, or now you can look at a Shea Hope or any of the number of cricketers they have, and you appreciate what they bring to the scene, the geometry of their work and the spectacle of watching them. And then you have these people telling you, but you're not British if you do that.
Yeah. And I think you've described it so well that I'm not even going to try and add to that specific. I'm going to it gives me another like additive element, which is that if you were to, let's say you did choose to live here and you were like, England, I am British, I'm all in on that, I support England, and some of those manifestations are, supporting the sports team. So I support England cricket and I go along to the match. You never know when, again, how you're going to be accepted in that way. Like, there are very, like we described in terms of fans' attitudes towards the players on the pitch, those would also be reflexive in the crowd among them too. So if they don't choose not to like the Moeen Alis or the non-white players on the field, which is very possible, as a non-white fan, you are liable then to either be the embodiment of that player on the pitch, and the blame might be directed towards you, or at the more sort of acute end, the sort of low-level or sometimes high-level racist chants or songs that might be made up about opposing players, which is all seen in like the banter and the fun of passionate fandom, might actually affect your own cultural identity and heritage and this and that, and you might become the butt of a joke, or just not even a joke, a racist rebuke. So it's not really an environment that caters to difference at all, fandom, at national sports level at all. There's this wonderful organization that exists here in the UK called the Three Hijabis, who are a series of passionate England football fans who recognize that, like, they loved English football, but they weren't really accepted in the mainstream among England football fans. So they sort of carved out their own niche, and they're really prominent activists in terms of changing attitudes towards what being a football fan is. And I think more and more what we're seeing is Muslims in society, in Britain at least, which is where my attention tends to be, are carving out what I'm going to say is in a positive way, are carving out safe spaces to actually enjoy your hobbies, enjoy your passions, but in a way that protects you from the cultural mainstream that might be a source of violence or attacks or just like uncomfortableness. And that could be, we've talked about already, attitudes towards things that don't fit into your culture, like drinking alcohol or things of that nature, or just protecting oneself and finding commonality with your fellow person that shares parts of your identity and your passions too.
Yeah, I mean, talking about alcohol, I mean, so much of cricket in England at the recreational level is about playing a game and then going to the bar with your teammates and having a good time, right? Now, it is assumed that everybody is totally comfortable doing that, and that is how, in fact, if you just play the game and if you go home, there is a sense that you are not a team player because you're not socializing with the team. And you're not, but the point is that you're not going for a coffee after the game, but you're going for a drink. And maybe I'm not comfortable having that drink. And of course, if my religion has a certain say on that, of course, I'm going to be quite particular about not coming. So there is really no like, what I'm trying to say is that there is no real deep introspection about why the social structure of Britain. I mean, this came up in the Azim Rafiq case as well, where people were forcing wine down his throat, or alcohol down his throat, and that's abuse. I mean, to put it plainly. So it doesn't seem to be any real introspection about ways in which you can, accommodate. Instead, it is how people need to fit in even in this context.
Totally, I think. Again, drawing outwards from cricket, it is a societal aspect of a British culture, right? Whether that's the sort of after work drinks, as a very sort or pubs as a sort of community space and meeting place and part of the sort of fabric and social structure of this country, which is very, very embedded. And I think there's just so much there to think about. Like for instance, if we're trending towards like improved attitudes in a workplace, whether that's limiting discrimination or having sort of strong labor rights, anything like alcohol, which can affect people's minds and ability to do their work or just their behavior in general, doesn't necessarily fit with those standards, right? So it's like, where does one's overall motivation lie? I think, as a lifelong socialist myself as well, when I think about Azim Rafiq, there's an aspect to his case that, like, to me, firmly just lives in like the labor rights scenario, right? This was a man who was abused in his workplace and was in a hostile work environment. Like that is enough to create whether like a punishment for that, or there should be sort of rebukes of that or consequences for that, let alone the high specifics that exist there. I think that like it's really tough because I'm born and brought up here, and to a certain extent as well, you just sort of accept a place for what it is too, and there are nice things about that as well as things that then when you spend too much time worrying or wondering about them, you're like, well, this doesn't seem quite right to me. And on an individual level, I think people can be persuaded to change their attitudes in that way. I think there is, I tend to be an optimist in many respects in that way, but there's, again, the burden is always on the person in the minority position. And I think that's really where the balance of power should shift, right? People who are in the majority, in the mainstream, should look outwardly and be like, how can I accommodate, like you said, those who are in a different position to me, rather than always asking me to put my hand up and say, actually, I'm really sorry, this doesn't quite fit with me. And am I now going to be the one left out as a consequence of that? Because that's really hard to do, and that's really uncomfortable. And again, reminds me of Azim Rafiq, like his choice to speak out came after years and years of thinking about this, having endured it. So how much do you think he equivocated about, can I actually do this? Can I speak out? And then we've seen the backlash, we've seen the consequences of his choices and how everything about his person, his identity is coming to question as a consequence of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple. In an office situation, if you have 2 or 3 people who don't drink, and if you want to have an office setting, you would do something that would be non-alcohol related. And then maybe after a couple of hours, you say, okay, now the rest of us are going to the bar. And that's fine. But here it's like, finish the game and go to the bar. And if you don't come, you're like, so yeah, it's more than anything, it's just a lack of sensitivity to people's preferences.
The thing that makes me laugh a lot is that, like, here in the UK, perhaps is maybe only a London thing, is that nowadays it's very trendy to not drink too, even if you were a drinker. The biggest growing like drinks thing is like no or low alcohol. So like even for the cultural mainstream now, like the new fad is not to drink. And so again, like it's always on those terms, right? 10 years ago, if you were the person saying, oh, tonight I'm not drinking, or not for me, you would be like, everyone would be like, whoa, yeah, well, like exactly like you described, you'd stick out. But now it's like, okay, cool, like we're all doing that, that's a cool new healthy thing to do or whatever.
Exactly how it was with smoking, right? Back in the 60s and 70s, everyone smoked, and the people who didn't smoke were like, what's wrong with you? But now it's like, come on. The person who smokes is the one who's now the outcast. So yeah,
Yeah.
it just takes time, but it's amazing how people take so long to actually sensitize themselves to different preferences. The question I had about Azim Rafiq, just to round that off, is
Yeah.
that at the end of it, look at the cost he's paid. I mean, here's a person who spoke up. He was extremely brave. He came out, he spoke, he gave testimony, he wept. He brought out so many things that were wrong with the place. But now he's been forced to leave the country. He's been subjected to mental torture, almost like people constantly getting after him, whether it's in real life or in social media or wherever it is. So why would the next person even attempt to do anything like it? Look at the cost he's paid.
Yeah, I think that's the first instinctive thought one has to have. It's so tragic. I think the essence of his desire to speak out has been lost. If I were to put myself in his shoes and say, and I was there thinking before I'd ever shared this story, like, again, deliberating what might happen, what if you draw up a pros and cons list, like quite literally, and be like, what could I achieve through this? Even if it was just for me, justice for myself, peace of mind, whatever he considered there, and the cons. I don't know that he could ever have imagined so much backlash, right? Because it's sort of undeniable evidence on the one hand. It's reached the highest possible. It was on the front pages of our news, right? It was on the television. His testimony he gave to government committees, things of that nature. And I will say, I think there's also been an outpouring of support for him. So there would have been a moment, I think, of hope within this whole process where he felt, look, I've really put my neck on the line. I really, exposed myself. But hopefully there will be some change that comes from this. But like we've seen, with just about 3 years on from this sort of worldwide protest that came after the murder of George Floyd, and this supposed, worldwide response to Black Lives Matter, and people really supposedly being introspective and saying, we're going to change, we're going to, acknowledge that we have a societal issue with racism, and we're going to fix all of that. We're 3 years later, and nothing has really changed, in my personal opinion. These things are flash in the pan things, and ultimately, again, like the weight of the cultural hegemony and the establishment wins out. And that for Azim Rafiq was probably a really, really tough turning point, where it was like, well, we're going to call into question now whether or not this stuff is valid, because this guy maybe has some dodgy business dealings with his fellow player who spoke on his behalf. Let's dig into his past and see if he is a worthy person of, our time, whether his own testimony can be considered valid, if he's ever done anything wrong in his life. So if you measure a person in that way, that sort of bad faith argument having taken place, it's all done in bad faith, in my opinion, to sort of, squash the overall idea of the thing, which is, can we prevent this happening for the next person? Can we root this out and improve cricket as a whole? So that's what's been really, I think, sad, is that those who are in charge haven't recognized the roles that they should play in fixing it. Let's say if it was just in cricket, it's not about them supporting necessarily this one individual and giving him what he might need, because I don't think that's quantifiable either. Like, this man's life has been ruined by this situation. You can't that's indelible. It's the job, Azim Rafiq, to not to speak on his behalf, but you would hope that one of his motivations or goals was like, how do I prevent this happening for the next me? And I don't know that, if sitting here now, whether I feel like that the steps are being taken to achieve that outcome among the cricketing establishment. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we had a couple of months ago, we had Henry Olonga on the podcast, and Henry Olonga was former Zimbabwe cricketer who stood up to the sort of the dictatorial policies of Robert Mugabe back in Zimbabwe. And after all these years, Olonga tells me in the podcast that I wouldn't recommend any young player to do that again, because of the amount he lost, and of the cost that he had to pay for what he said and what he felt. So, and I wouldn't be surprised if Azim Rafiq turns around and says the same thing now or a few years later, because it's terrible what societies can do to someone who is trying to do the right thing. I mean, it's always taken in bad faith, and that's the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's understanding what each of our roles are to play, isn't it? And that to me always comes back to an understanding of a system, which is like who holds the power in this equation. As far as I understand it, with the sort of the way in which things played out with Azim Rafiq's specific case, the people at the top of the pyramid here, whether that was the ECB or Yorkshire County Cricket Club themselves, or esteemed eminent figures in cricket, never took the burden on their shoulders to do what they needed to do. They would just sort of put through this man to the lions and said, you fight for your thing, your little social justice cause over here, or whatever that might be, your peace of mind. And that is such a terrible thing, Again, coming from a team setup, I think that's what makes it really painful. Is like you would think that those who could either put themselves in his shoes or say, take a step back and be like, wow, we treated one of our own in this way. We must make sure that never happens again. Like what that's what leadership is about to me. That is what cricket is about. Again, I think the play to me was a way to question all of these things. Cricket is held up as this institution of like gentlemanly conduct. And,
which has been proved as bogus many, many years before. Yeah,
exactly. All of these like manners and traditions, the idea that like a batsman would, he would own up to if he'd edged the ball and give himself out, and all this stuff. And like, firstly, those things that, to me are often in direct competition to like competitiveness itself. So there's a natural contradiction there anyway. And then, like you said, like it's just not a true picture of cricket whatsoever.
Well, cricket in the early days of cricket's history was a completely betting game. In fact, the newspapers of that time, which were often the pamphlets that were handed out, used to print out the amount of money that was bet on each game. So let's stop the bogus about this gentlemanly game and all that straight away. Also, Mike Marquisi's book, War Minus the Shooting, is the book we published, but his book, Anyone But England, lays bare everything that Azim Rafiq has basically been bringing to light. I mean, the racism in Yorkshire in the 80s and 90s, as Marquesi details that straight through. And, the sort of the gory sights of supporters getting like a stuffed pig into the stadium. I mean, these are things that have been going on for a long time. And again, plain abuse and plain hate. And I want to touch upon a point on the flip side, though, talking about assimilation and talking about there is no woman character in the play. The mother is not really we don't know anything about Ismail's mother. That we know about the relationship with him and his father. There's no friend. I mean, I guess it's a boys' school, so it's perhaps there's no girl there, and there's also no lady teacher or anyone of that sort. Was that deliberate? And is it also like an indication of the sort of the masculine sort of zone that cricket often puts you in? And also, is it a commentary on the British Muslim experience in itself, where there is a bit of invisibility in terms of women at times?
Yeah, I mean, at the very boring end of it, functionally speaking, the play is set up as a one-person show, and with the number of characters that I'd already written into the show, at some point in time, some characters, unfortunately, were cut, and that's a real shame for me. Like, I think at times there was a grandma, a great aunt, and a mother, and in the dramaturgical process, they all got homogenized into a grandma who actually doesn't speak either. But there's some nice moments in the play where Ismail sits with his dadi, and he talks to her about his cricket and his failures and this.
His dadi, correct? I should have mentioned that. Yeah.
And again, that sort of was trying to give a little flavor of intergenerational stuff there, and this family idea that like we're all in this place now. What are all our differing attitudes to this place that exists across 3 generations? A dadi that doesn't speak English, who's come here as an older person, versus a dad that moved here and a child that's born here. Trying to give that that range of experiences there. But like you described, I think the school environment is set up in a very male way. His friends, his teachers, and that stuff. And I think. Well, really, also the other aspect of why it's called Duck obviously listeners haven't seen or read the play yet, is that Ismail, when everything starts to go wrong for him, he retreats to this duck pond of sort of a quiet place that he runs away to, and he finds solace in just sort of being able to be there and talk about his feelings to these passive creatures, these ducks in the duck pond who can't speak back to him, who maybe can't hear or understand him, but it gives him an outlet of how he's feeling. And I think that speaks to a male experience too, that we hear all the time about how men don't have a way to process their emotions, or either are told not to be emotional in many ways. And for men to sort of contend with mental health struggles is considered very much like a failure of masculinity or that sort of thing. And for this 15-year-old, I think he's really struggling because his life's been pretty good until now, and this is the first time things are going badly for him, so he's just unequipped to deal with that. But the thing that I was really trying to nail was, like, especially this is an experience that people of color will relate to, or people in the minority will relate to, is that, like, in those live situations where you've been discriminated against or wronged or have those feelings, it's often, especially at a young age, you can't process that and you don't know what's really happened to you. And it's only later on, after the fact, that feeling will probably sit with you. But, I'm still figuring out at this age, remembering things that happened to me in my past and trying to better understand them. And the play is a bit of a function of that. And so we're seeing that we're living live alongside this boy in the moment and watching him grapple with what's happening to me. Maybe he's picking up the feelings, the codes, but he can't process it. And I think that's, to me, the really important experience for the audience is, like, they've got the benefit of knowing what's going on and what's happening to this person, and he can't. And I think that's very relatable and quite a sad element of the play.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me while reading the play about how, masculine cricket can often tend to be the language used, the stories that we tell, the banter, so-called banter, which can often be just plain abuse. I mean, banter is often not banter. How it's very difficult, how it's assumed that and for a 15-year-old and for that people of that age, it's there's so much going on in your life. You're understanding your attitude to the world. You're figuring out the changes in your body. There's so much happening around you. And then to be in that environment can be quite defeating at times. And I've noticed in my own experience, I mean, I played a bit of cricket when I was younger, but, there were people who's, again, it's a lack of sensitivity to people who may not like this environment. It was almost like, well, if you don't like it, then cricket's not for you. And that's such an exclusionary way to think about a sport. I mean, we talk about cricket being exclusionary in terms of just being played by a few countries and not really expanding its global reach. But what about expanding its own reach wherever it's even popular? I mean, why is it that there are only a certain class of people from some countries who play cricket? Why is it only certain people from certain schools come to cricket? And why don't people from other places play? I mean, there is that exclusionary bit even in countries that play cricket.
Yeah, I think I really questioned the whole notion of, like, sports in a school in this writing process too, because I'm not a parent myself, but I think a lot of parents, when they put their children forward for things like sports, they probably are sold on this concept of, like, they're going to learn about teamwork and it's going to be, like, fun, and they'll run around and get exercise and learn to play with other children and find something that they enjoy, perhaps. And then the environment we find it in, which is sort of this elite school team thing, kind of like you said already, it's like there's no room for error here. It's like win at all costs. You're very expendable. You're only as good enough as your ability, which they're completely different sentiments that perhaps we should be building in an environment like sports, for young people especially. I think there could be and can be really amazing versions of that I haven't seen. For instance, I've spent most of my life living in the UK, where sport was completely gender segregated. And then when I went to live in America for some time, I played recreational sports like softball, which was always all genders, and indoor football, again, always all genders. And I was like, why is this a new experience for me, firstly? And then I was like, well, why is sport ever gendered in this way, especially at a young age, especially at a recreational age? It would just really open my mind in a way that I'd never really been challenged before, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, I think that, again, what I was trying to achieve with the play is, like, question what the function of sport is in this young person's life, and it's all bad. Actually, I think it's like it gives him this status at the beginning, which is like really confusing because it's not how the world operates at all. He's kind of he's in this great position because he's good at cricket, but like it can really quickly be taken away from him. And then like going back to what you said before about like banter and things like that, like school children can be really cruel to one another. So if you're like lesser than in the construct of whatever's being created here, you're just rife for abuse or exploitation, or you can just be made fun of. And that's all really nasty stuff.
It is. And, at the end of the play, I was thinking, I mean, again, as a background, here's this boy, Ismail, who's like a really good cricketer. He's really popular because he's really talented and he has all these strokes that many others can't really play. But then he has a few failures, again in quotes, a couple of ducks, and he's on the outer, and he's treated as somebody who is not good enough. And there's this coach who is also not giving him really any benefit of doubt, because he's holding him up to like a really, really high standard of someone who should be breaking all records. One of the thoughts that came to me was, can Ismail ever play cricket after this? I mean, it leaves such a scar on people at that age, at the age of 15. You almost feel like he might run away from the sport.
Yeah, I think that's really the journey. It's a question, and I don't know if I have a fixed answer in my own mind, but it is that culmination of a journey that starts with innocent joy. Like his first introduction to cricket would have been through his father. They share that love and that passion for it. And you can just imagine, a young child just getting so much joy out of that experience. He talks again in the play about like his daddy throwing him tennis balls and him smacking them all over the place. And that very pure essence of what sport can be to a person, going through all of these experiences, being really great in a really specific context, then it not working out for him. And where does that leave him? And yeah, I think it's like, it's part of this larger conversation for a young person about at that age, what becomes important, what's less important. And that again goes back to the play being set in 2005 after the 7/7 bombings as a young British Muslim teenager now. Like, what is important to him? At the beginning of the play, the only thing that mattered was cricket and being great at cricket. By the end of the play, he's starting to learn what it's like to be a brown person in the white school, a Muslim person in a British society that's hostile to Muslims. And yeah, I think cricket, unfortunately, is going to be a lot less important to him moving forward. And like you said, the scars of it, can he ever recover from that? And is it just the joy and the whatever he derived that was wonderful about cricket is I think gone away, been ripped away from him, and could never really be the same?
Yeah, I mean, you spoke about the joy of it. One thing I must tell people is that this is a wonderfully written play. I mean, there's a lot of fine lines here, fine writing and fine sentences. I mean, I wish cricket writing was like this in the mainstream. I mean, you often get a lot of cliches with cricket, and that he batted when it mattered and things like that, but not really describing what happened. And I want to read out this lovely little paragraph that he has been written about Ismail. It's almost like Ismail is ruminating about this, and I quote, "When you watch cricket from a distance, there's a trick of the eye, a split-second delay that comes after ball hits bat, before you hear the sound of leather against willow, the margin between the speed of light and the speed of sound. It's a beautiful thing." Close quote. It's a fabulous paragraph. I mean, it sort of gets you into the mood of why you watch cricket and what you get from it and the sensorial experience of the game. And, we have this thing in the discourse about how, if there are not enough people in the stadium or people in the stands, that this is a dreadful situation for cricket and how it's so boring. But some of my favorite experiences of cricket are actually in an empty ground, because you can actually hear everything there, and the sound of that bat on ball, it just gets you so hooked. It's quite intoxicating at times to hear that. And often the really good players, the sound gets even sweeter because they hit it right from the sweet spot of the bat. And you're like, that ball doesn't sound the same when I hit it. There's something going on with that player who's so good to do that.
Well, I think you've absolutely described the fan experience and the things that I've always derived as joyful from watching cricket so well there. And clearly they were the things that came to me in my mind when I sat down to write the play, which obviously being for the theatre, there'll hopefully be some people that come along that are cricket fans and will, can instantly get that feeling. But I wanted to try and find a way to create that for people that haven't necessarily had that experience too, and may not know all of these specific joys that we feel about sitting in the stands or even just on the edge of a field, and the pleasures that can come from participating in cricket. And I hadn't been to see a live cricket match in quite some time. But this week, my dad and I had the pleasure of going along to the first day of the Test World Final.
At the Oval?
Yeah, it's on Wednesday. I was down there, and it was amazing to be, in the mode of making this play and getting to watch live cricket and have these things reconfirmed to me after some time. That, I'm 200 yards away up in a stand and marveling at just what you described, the difference between a ball struck out of the middle, out of the sweet spot versus elsewhere on the bat. The difference between, a master of his craft and someone who's just, protecting his wicket. And it's those things that are so specific. And, I've talked to my creative team so much about that. It's the smells, the sounds, these things that stay with you for a lifetime, the textures of cricket that are so specific. And I think, those joys will never leave me personally when it comes to something like cricket. It's been a big part of my life.
Yeah, it's amazing how easy it is to forget, what really drew us to the game. And it takes people to actually go to the ground or to actually watch a game. It could even be like a school's game, a seconds 11 game, but just sitting there, seeing the movements, seeing the players, seeing the field change. That day I was just watching that match at the Oval, and there was this camera view from top that the spider cam that they call it, which is basically gives you the aerial view of the whole ground. And it was just there for a while, and I was just watching all these players like ants, just moving from this to that, and just that very geometric movement of it was so beautiful. It was like, isn't it great, like after every over there's this change that happens, and then it's almost like a ritual that people are enacting, and you forget these things very easily at times about why you love the game so much, and those little things that make it so beautiful. I mean, there's so much cricket that happens these days that sometimes you're like, okay, I don't even know what's happening. But it just takes those 5 minutes to sort of understand what's there to love.
Yeah, I couldn't put it better myself. Exactly. It's all of those things. And it's nice to have a through line in life of things that you can immediately, you can hear a sound and it can remind you of something from 20 years ago. And I think that's what's really special. And my relationship to cricket has changed over my lifetime, as I think it would for most people that aren't professionals. And I'm sure their relationships changed too as well. And it's like, it was really great for me to, especially having come through this 3-year process of writing a play about cricket, which questions a lot about, all of these nice things that we're talking about now, and calls them into question. It perhaps, shines a very different light on cricket as a game. But ultimately, being in the stands this week confirmed to me something I probably haven't thought about sometimes, like, do I love cricket? And the answer is very much yes. And it's going back to what we talked about, what it's like to be a fan, what it's like to be a player. I think, like with anything, being able to have one's own individual connection to something, no one can take that away from you, right? And you'll always find others out there who share that stuff with you too. And it's about finding that community, I think.
Yeah, wonderful. One thing about the end, though, of the play, again, quite a counter to what is in the public perception, that the 2005 Ashes, England won the Ashes, it was hugely popular series, and all these wave of new English fans came in, and especially the young people who are watching the sport, who are watching the game for the first time, got hooked to cricket, etc., etc. But at the end of the play, Ismail is actually not supporting England because there has been quite a shift in his sense of identity. I mean, of course, his parents immigrated from India, so there is that identity. But there's also this whole identity of, am I British? The 7/7 bombings happened. He's made to feel as the outsider. His cricket team, he's no longer has a place in the cricket team where he's been made to feel as the outsider. And it's quite profound that he actually doesn't support England in perhaps one of English cricket's greatest moments. And many people would think of this as unpatriotic, but I think it's actually far more interesting and profound than that. And it speaks to the very heart of what makes you a cricket fan.
Yeah, I wrestled with those choices for his character. And I think there's a moment in the play where him and his best friend have a falling out. And in that falling out, as I think if we can all remember when we were teenagers, it's the sort of way you treat your relationships. Everything's a little bit reactive and a little bit immature, perhaps. And I think one of the ways in which Ismail tries to distance himself from his friend, or hurt his friend, in fact, is by saying, I don't support England anymore. Like, that was the thing that they shared, and then now it's gone away and it's been broken. But also, we are watching this loss of innocence for a 15-year-old. His dad has educated him about the Tebet test. The 7/7 bombings have happened, like you said, and his frame of reference as to who he is in relatively to the country, to society as a whole, has massively shifted. And I think it's just hopefully it rings true for some people that, before that age, he may have just passively supported England because everyone else did, and it was easy to get whipped up into the frenzy of it all and the excitement of it all. But now it's sort of like, question mark, I have to give this thought. And that's just kind of sad again too, in the sense that we as people who aren't of the mainstream have to wrestle with these questions about ourselves and what people might say, and this and that, things that other people don't have to at all. And yeah, it's kind of an irony there too, because England, I would imagine, I'm trying to rack my brain, but I don't think England had been very good before that, by and large. So poor Ismail had probably been a fan of England, suffered through some pretty poor test series, perhaps, and then in the moment where they're really great, he's sort of has pulled away from it. And that's a bit of a shame. But also knowing with hindsight how good India gets, and maybe he becomes a big India fan, and that's a source of great passion and joy for him moving forwards.
Perhaps, yeah. Maybe he watches an India-England match at some point, and then supports India or something. But yeah, this whole wrestling with your feelings is so fundamental as a fan, and that's something that I realized much later in life. I mean, early on, you think fandom is this black and white. You support somebody, you don't support somebody. So if you have England playing against South Africa, you have a certain team, you support them. But every team and every player is something, it's a choice that you make. And even within that choice, there is so much of nuance within that. Like, would you, Kevin Peterson is a classic example that we brought up, right? Kevin Peterson playing for England. Like, would you support him? Would you not? Why would you? Why wouldn't you? Like, as a South African, I'm thinking, you may not, because you feel that he's deserted the country and he's run away. As an English person, you may not, because he's not your own, so to speak. In quotes again, even though he's a British citizen, as a person who's from some other country, you may have some other thoughts about him. Or Kevin Peterson may go on Twitter and make some atrocious comment for which you might cancel him, like many people often do these days, cancel people. And so it's a constant grapple. Like, I know several fans for the Indian team who are now, constantly grappling about whether to support this Indian team or not, because they have their own views about how the cricket board, the BCCI, is run, and the sort of the politicization of the BCCI, and the amount of economic heft and the sort of the arm twisting that the BCCI often does. So there is that contradiction. There's also a contradiction sometimes of the players who, decide to toe the line of the party in power, and so people are like, why are we even supporting these people? I mean, they are not even on the right side of history. So, but again, they are such fabulous players. You watch a cover drive from one of the players, and you're like, oh my god, how is he doing that? So I think being a fan cannot be seen as a black and white situation. It's far more nuanced, and you're bound to change your opinions now and then. But at the same time, the crucial aspect is that you're engaging with these different matters while watching sport, which otherwise you would probably never engage with. Like, if you were not watching any of these players, you would not even be thinking in that critical way, and that is a loss.
Exactly. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. I think is sort of a maturation in that respect, that perhaps, can this sport or this passion of mine also meet my standards in other areas of life? And, I think thinking about what you said about how we learn and know about different players these days, I think our proximity to people in general now is so reduced, right? People are very capable of expressing their full range of personalities and emotions, whether that's through social media or just through like always on content these days. So we know a lot more about these people that there used to be a degree of separation. They had a celebrity status or just sort of an allure from being removed from us that perhaps rarefied them, but also protected them in a certain way in our minds, as well as like just their abilities. Now we know every detail about their existence, which probably doesn't help in that way. And I think for me as a fan of sport as a whole in general, as I grow up, it massively changes. And like in that way, it's like, does it fit with my overall worldview? What are the good bits? What are the less good bits? How can I sort of try and encapsulate and participate in the good without, debasing and going to the stuff that's kind of ugly and lesser than, and keep learning, keep trying to find, where does my relationship to this thing continue to exist if you want it to at all. And yeah, we'll see.
So my final question is, do you support the English cricket team?
Great question. And it's not an easy answer for me, mainly because I think, like you described, in all of these different questions, I think my relationship to cricket has massively changed over time. I derive a huge amount of joy from watching cricket with my dad. Like, I think that it's a personal connection, and that's something I do with football as well. Like, I've been watching football with my dad since I was a very young child, and we share a relationship based around a mutual love for sport. I have a question mark in my mind, because I think growing up, he was a little bit ambivalent about which team he supported. So now if you were to ask him, he's an out and out India fan. And I don't know, he will claim that's always been the case, but I have a different understanding of that, or different memory of that. And for me, I think it's easy for me to root for England, being born here, and it's in close proximity to me. My opportunities to watch cricket will primarily revolve around England, whether that's just because it's on television or it's in front of me at a cricket ground. And I also think I would probably pick and choose a little bit among the players, and I've got some good things to say about some, and might keep my eye on a few others in that respect. And then if it's England versus India, if I was to really be very honest about it, my heart beats for India. And to me, what's really nice about that is I think I look at that as a really positive way for me to connect to a place that I am of, without having a closeness to. I've never lived in India. My family is all here, but that is my culture. That is my heritage. That's my identity. And I love the idea that I can connect with India through cricket. And so I've sort of engaged with it and drawn a huge amount of love for Indian cricket in that respect.
Fascinating. Wonderful chat, Maatin, and I wish you all the best for the play. I would urge all my listeners who live in Britain to please check out the play, and I will put a link to the details to the play in the show notes, and you can look out for tickets there. For everyone else, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. There is plenty of background reading that you can do. I can link Mike Marquis's Anyone But England. I can link, Moeen Ali's book itself is quite interesting to read. And there are a number of other bits of literature that I can link about this. There's also a wonderful paper that I read, like an academic paper that I read about this issue from 2010 that talks about the reaction of cricket to the 7/7 bombings and things. So yeah, all that I will link. Also a regular reminder to our listeners that we are in the book republishing space. War Minus the Shooting by Mike Marquis is was the first book that we republished. It was published in 1996, and now it's out again. We also brought out Cricket Beyond the Bazaar by Mike Coward, and we recently got out a wonderful book called The Summer Game by Gideon Hay. It is one of Gideon Hay's earliest books, and it's a joy to read for anyone interested in the history of cricket in Australia. So all those links will be put in there. And Maatin, all the best, and hope we see fantastic Ashes yet again.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you so much for the conversation. This is absolutely wonderful to talk to you. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, and we'll see you in about a week or 10 days' time.
India have won the series. They're going to get back for two.